Infamous Gambino Family mobster Roy DeMeo was a Roman Catholic. He was also an alleged serial killer, quite a combination. He did a lot of wet work in his criminal career. The estimates of his number of victims ranges from 75 to 200. Not surprisingly, he too met a violent end as he was eliminated by his own crime family in 1983 in a rather unceremonious fashion. His lifeless body was found in the trunk of his car. It had been left there for several days and was so badly decomposed, his family opted for a closed casket funeral. As you can imagine, this was very traumatic for his loved ones, most notably his only son Albert, who was just a 17-year-old high school student at the time his father was killed. It was Albert who took on the role as man of the house in the aftermath of his father's death. Albert idolized his father and wanted to honor his life as best he could. Although Roy DeMeo hadn't attended church in years, he was still nominally Catholic, and Albert wanted a Catholic funeral service for him. But given the controversy surrounding his father's life and death, getting a Catholic burial was problematic, to say the least. But can you believe that Albert managed to pull it off? That is, Roy DeMeo, a confirmed mafia member and known killer, was eventually granted a Catholic burial despite his horrific past. So how did Albert get a Catholic funeral for his father? According to his autobiography, For the Sins of My Father, this is how it went down. First, some additional context. Albert was the one who took on the responsibility of identifying his father's corpse in the morgue and making the funeral arrangements. He was also responsible for dealing with the church where his father's wake was held. He did not provide the name of the church where the wake was held, but he did give a couple of clues. He said his neighborhood called it the Godfather's Church, and that mobster Carlo Gambino frequently attended and made some large donations, such as a stained glass window and brass doors, to the sanctuary. Based on those clues, it's most likely Our Lady of Grace Church, which is where Carlo Gambino's extravagant funeral was held. Let me know in the comments if I got it right. Albert didn't know the priest at the church, but the priest knew who Albert was. This is where it gets interesting. So Albert introduced himself to the priest, and he said the priest was not welcoming. In fact, he had a barely concealed sneer on his face. As Albert began to explain that he needed him to officiate a mass for Roy's wake, the priest immediately began to object. The priest said, "I don't think it would be appropriate to wake your father here. Besides, it's impossible to schedule on such short notice." Albert knew what the priest was really saying. A hoodlum like his father was not welcome there, even in death. But Albert was no fool. He knew it was a mobbed-up church. So he reached into his pocket and began to peel $100 bills off a roll into the priest's hand. After the first few bills, he looked up at the priest and said, "Would it be possible now?" By this point, the priest's sneer changed to a smile. "Certainly, Mr. DeMeo. What time did you want the mass to begin?" Albert then counted out a few more bills, answered the priest's question, and left in disgust. "Another man of God with his hand out," is how Albert ultimately described the priest. So that's how Roy DeMeo got a Catholic burial. His son effectively bribed the priest. A little bit of money, and the priest changed his stance from impossible to when do you want it done? Can you believe it? I do, and I also believe this is something that's happened countless times in the past, as so many mafiosi are buried in Catholic cemeteries. As an aside, the topic of gangsters getting Catholic burials is fascinating to me. The greed, corruption, hypocrisy, and strangely, grace and forgiveness this requires makes for some great stories. Expect more videos about this topic very soon. As always, thanks for listening.